Hey everybody, it's Landa. Today we're going to learn how to paint this cute little painting using just the gradient method. Gradients are literally in everything. So join me today. We're going to learn how to use two different techniques to create gradients, and I'm going to show you how to make this cute little landscape. So grab all your watercolor supplies and let's get started. A gradient is something that goes from light to dark. I want to show you very specifically with some of these different pictures what a gradient looks like. So if you're doing a landscape like this one where it has the sky and the ocean, the gradient is where it goes from dark to light, and then it meets that ocean, and the ocean goes from dark to light. So a gradient can go from light to dark or dark to light. That is it. So that's all a gradient is. And the goal for today is to show you three different things. I'm going to show you two different methods on how to create a gradient with watercolor. And I'm going to show you how to identify gradients when you're looking at a reference image and how to create a realistic gradient in a sphere. So I have my watercolor paints, I have my paper, paint brushes, some swatches, and some water. Before we practice how to paint very specific things like a landscape or objects, the first thing I want to show you are some different methods to create a gradient. So one of the most probably basic methods that you may have come across is the wet into wet. So that is where I'm going to get some of my water here, and I am going to paint part of the paper. You could do the whole entire thing. This is totally up to you, but I'm going to show you a few different methods in one go. And I'm just saturating the paper with water. So that is wet. The surface is wet. Now I'm going to take my brush that I'm going to paint with, and I'm going to grab any color. Now, if you want to start thinking about a landscape, you can start out with a blue for sky or the ocean. And we're just going to paint the top part of that wet surface. So I'm going to create a stripe with really concentrated paint. And just to show you how concentrated that is, look at how dark that is. That's pretty dark, but it's not dripping. So if I can do this and it doesn't leave like a big drip, that's exactly where you want to be. So I'm going to take this, I'm just going to paint right on the top, just a little strip. You can see it immediately spreads if my paper is really saturated with water. I'm going to wash my brush out. I'm dabbing my brush off on either a paper towel, or I really like these Swedish dishcloths. And now what you're going to do, right at, not in the paint, but below where the paint is on that wet surface with just a clean wet brush, I'm going to paint up towards that saturated area. I'm going to touch it and just barely, and then I'm going to drag it down. And if that see how it's already starting to go from dark to light? That is our gradient. And I'm going to keep dragging that until it dissipates. That's it. So there's your gradient. Let's practice it again. So this is the wet into wet technique, just to create a basic gradient. This is something that I do in my Watercolor 101 courses. One of the first things that you're going to do is practice a lot of gradients. So right now I'm just creating a second shape. And I'm going to use a different color. Now I'm going to use some turquoise. So the same thing. So wet into wet means I'm wetting the surface. And now I'm going to add some saturated paint where I want the darkest part of my gradient to be, which for right now is just at the top. Okay, so I made that stripe. I'm going to dab off a little extra so it's more saturated. I'm going to wash my brush out, dab off a tiny bit. I don't want it to be drippy. And starting from maybe the midsection of that shape, I'm going to push up. I have a wet brush, touch just the edge of that, and then I'm going to drag it down. Now you can see with this gradient, it didn't come as far as the first one, probably because the first one had, maybe the first block was really, really saturated with water, and this second one isn't. So if this happens to you where it just looks like a stripe, you're going to go back in, you kind of go up, and then you go down, and then you go up, and then you go down. So I'm going to go back where I was, and I'm going to grab a little bit more of that paint and slowly drag it down. And then go up. If it gets too far, if it gets too dark down here, then you're pushing it back up. So your motion is telling the paint where to go. So either if I drag it down, I'm pulling that paint down this way, right? And if I push it back up, I'm moving it back up. That works as long as the surface of the paper is wet. So this is your gradient with wet into wet. okay? Now let's do that with an actual shape. So this is really great if you're working on a sky or something like that, or the ocean, but sometimes you want to create a gradient with the wet into wet with an actual shape. So I'm going to show you with a sphere. So let's just find something round. The washi tape is kind of perfect for this. And I'm going to do a few circles with pencil. So I want to practice 2 times. Okay. And I'm going to wet the whole entire surface in that circle. And the difference here is that we're going to swap the direction of our gradient. So when we've practiced our first basic gradient, we went from dark to light. Now remember, a gradient is it can be from dark to light or light to dark. And just like, you know, an eyeball, a grape, or an olive, or one of these balls, there's always a lighter area, right? And usually if it's an object that is sitting on a surface, the bottom of that is going to be darker than the top because that's in shadow. So to identify where our gradient needs to be, the darker part, unlike what we just did, that darker area will start at the base, and then we gradually pull that out towards the top. So let's practice that. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to wet the surface of that circle that I traced. Because remember, we're only practicing the wet into wet technique to create our gradient. Now I'm going to choose any color, and just for the fun of it, let's use red so that it mimics this ball here. And I'm going to focus on the darkest area first, just like I did with my previous gradient. Surface is wet. I'm going to make the shape of whatever that object is. So this is what I like to say is follow the form. So if the form is a circle, I'm not going to draw a vertical line, right? Or a horizontal line. I'm going to follow the form and paint right where that darker area is first. And I'm going to just keep painting. I'm going to let that kind of do its magic. And if I need a bigger stripe, because there's a lot of shadow here, I'm going to add more paint. Just like we did up here, I'm going to wash my brush out. I'm going to dab off a little extra, not all of it. And I'm going to start in this wet white area, and I'm going to paint towards the paint. And I'm going to push towards that paint. See how I'm pushing and it kind of soaks it up and it lifts it? And then if I need to drag it back out, I will. I can always add it back in by dabbing it. So let's do that again. So clean brush. I'm going to start in this white area. And I'm going to touch that paint, and then I'm going to wiggle it out. And I'm dragging it out. There we go. Let's try that one more time. So what you're going to do, paint that shape, that circle, because remember we're practicing a sphere. Grab one of your colors. I'm going to use green just for fun. It's the complementary color to red. And this is very saturated. My paintbrush is not going to drip. So just to show you the consistency of this paint, see how dark that is? It's not drippy. So if I do this, you're not going to see it left over on the swatch. Okay. Now I'm going to take that I just used some up, so I have to grab a little bit more. And I'm going to follow the form, which is a curve. I'm going to start in the darkest area first because that paint's going to spread since I'm using the wet into wet technique. And I'm going to paint the darkest shape first before I wash my brush out. Now I kind of went beyond that, so I'm just going to make my circle bigger. Mistakes are fine. Now wash my brush out. dab off just a little. So just to show you, I still have, brush isn't totally clean either. Dab that off so that there's water in my brush, but I'm not adding more water, because what will happen is if you leave a drop of water here, it's going to push out against the paint. It's going to create a mess. So you want the brush to be damp, but not dry, because if it's dry, it'll act like a sponge and go, and if it's too wet, then it'll leave water and push out like that. So my damp brush is going to start in that dry, not dry, but the white area. And I'm going to start to paint towards that. I'm going to touch the edge of where that paint is, and then I'm going to drag it out just like I did before. And if I need to go back, I go back, I push back into it, and then I drag some of that out. Now, if it's too light, or if you don't like it, or maybe you have a little shadow, kind of like in this, this pool ball over here, there's a shadow on that left side, you can add it with some really concentrated paint. It can't be really wet, and then you can just paint directly while the surface is still wet. So there you go. So that is our first method. In just a second, I'm gonna show you my second method, which is a very quick version, especially the second method is a direct painting method. I like to call it the outline method. Typically use the outline method with small shapes. So if I'm gonna paint something really small, like these tiny little olives, then I might not use the wet into wet, because I'm not going to have as much control. So that's why I would choose the outline method to create a smaller gradient. Whereas if I'm doing a big landscape, I'm not going to use the outline method because it'll dry too fast. I'm going to show you the same thing that we did before. So this first one right here, let me write on here for a second. This is the wet into wet method. Okay, and this method right here, that is the outline method. And I'm going to do the same thing. We're going to do 2 spheres. We're also going to do 2 basic gradients, just so you can see the difference. But I will use different colors. So the trick here is that you're going to move a little bit quicker. You're actually going to start with that dark line, and then you're going to use water to blend that out. So if you've ever used one of my watercolor kits, you might have read it. Part of the directions or one of the steps says, blend it out with a clean, damp brush. That is very key for what we're about to do. First thing I'm going to do is prep my paint. I'm going to use purple this time. And I'm just going to make a little stripe. So the paper is dry. This is a direct painting. This is pretty drippy. I'd actually make it a little less wet if I'm working in a small space. Now I'm going to wash my brush out, dab off a little water, but not as much as I dabbed off for the first practice with the wet into wet gradient. And I'm going to start at the base, and I'm going to paint up. I'm going to touch that, and then I'm going to drag it out. See how quick that was? But the problem is that you can't, if you start out with a big pool of water, then it's going to spread really fast like that. But you can just soak it up. Okay, so see how quick that was? I am a fast painter in certain ways, and I love doing it like this. Again, this is a direct painting method for creating a gradient. We started with a dry surface, we painted that stripe, and then we blended it out with a clean, damp brush. Let's do that again. I'm going to do one more so you can see it again. So I have my clean brush. Let's use how about alizarin crimson, just to mix it up a little bit. So concentrated paint a nice stripe. That is more the consistency that you want. It shouldn't be super drippy. So if I have my swatch here, same thing as we had before, right? If I hold my brush vertically, it's not going to create lots of drips. That's the amount of paint that I want for this. So I make that stripe, and while that stripe is still damp and wet, wash my brush out really well, dab off the water a little bit, and then start from the base and kind of paint up, touch that edge, and then slowly drag it out. And if I got to the bottom, I immediately went for more water because it got dry. And so then I'm going to push it back up, because that's how you make a nice soft gradient, right? I'm going to go all the way to the top to make sure that it's even. And then I'm going to drag that out. And I could keep going. Get a little bit more water and push it up. Now, the trick to this one, which makes this method a little bit more tricky, is that you're working with a dry surface. So anytime where the paint that you add isn't the same moisture level as the paint that's on the surface, there are a lot of opportunities for cauliflowering or weird little things like this little blob right here. So that just meant that that was really wet up against a drying surface. Okay. Now let's put this into practice. So before, this is our wet into wet method to make our gradients. This is our direct painting outline method. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to grab something round, just my washi tape. I'm going to trace it twice. Let's create one of these. I'm going to do a blue one since we haven't done that yet. Now I'm going to grab a little bit of my blue here. It's just ultramarine blue. I'm painting directly in the shadowed side. And then I'll wash my brush out, blend it out with a clean, damp brush. Now you do have to be quick about it. And if I painted something larger than this shape, I would shift to the wet into wet method. Grab some of my water, and I'm going to paint towards that edge, and I'm going to push it out and blend it out. You can see this is a lot more controlled. This is my style of painting. I like a very controlled, high contrast gradient, or just really anything. So see the difference? You're gonna have a lot more control with this direct painting method, but it is a little bit more challenging. So if you want something that you're not too worried about it, it's in a really big space, or it's a sky, or it's part of the earth, then I would say use wet into wet. If you're creating something that's really controlled, here, I'll show you something really controlled. Here's one of my watercolor kits. If I'm painting those tiny little strawberries right there, that is the method I just showed you. Okay, and in a second, maybe I'll just show you how to do that. Let's practice one more time, and then I'll show you how I managed to make those teeny tiny little strawberries on there. So the first thing you're doing is you're choosing your color. Let's see, I haven't done orange yet, so let's do that. And I'm actually let's mix it up with whatever this is. Okay, and I'm gonna paint directly in the shadowed area, so the darkest area first, with my super saturated but not drippy brush. Remember, there are no drips. If I turn this upside down, it's not going to drip on anything. And let's start in that dark area. And I'm going to paint this. Remember, I'm following the form, so it's not a hard, vertical line, horizontal line. This is a curved line because I'm following that shape. Wash my brush out immediately. I always paint the bottom of my water cup so that it really cleans out my brush. Dab off a little extra, paint towards the edge, and then just wiggle that out. See how controlled that is? I just like that. I feel like I can paint like it's a, I don't know, colored pencil or something. And I enjoy that. And I'm just getting a little extra water to pull that out. And then I'm going to wiggle anything else that is not blending. All right. This, again, this is that direct outline method. I'm going to write the name of that. Okay. There you go. These are the two methods. In just a second, what we're going to do is we're going to put all this into practice. We're going to make a little landscape and we'll practice that. Oh, and actually before we do that, I wanted to show you very quickly how I can use the direct outline method to create one of these little strawberries. So just very quickly, I'm going to draw one of those. You can get a sense. Oh, and these are really tiny, so let's draw a really tiny one. Here you go. It's about that shape. I'm going to do exactly the same thing that I did before. I'm going to grab some of my my paint. I'm going to focus on that shadowed side. So the shadows here in this picture are on the left-hand side. So I'm going to paint that edge. So concentrated. Look at how concentrated it is. You can almost see how dry the paper is. Wash my brush out. I'm going to dab it off on it. I'm also rolling my brush to get it to a fine point since this is a tiny space. I'm starting in that white area, and then I'm just going to barely touch the edge. Look at that. Done. There's a cute little strawberry. There you go. Okay, now get some fresh water. Back in a second with some new paper so I can show you how to paint a little landscape. Now we're going to practice doing that in an actual picture. So we're going to mostly use the wet into wet method because this is a landscape. So remember I mentioned earlier that the larger space that you work in, you need to maybe choose the wet into wet method to create a gradient versus the direct method because you don't want it to dry with lots of lines. So that's what we're going to do. So you can choose any blues that you like. I'm going to just choose whatever random blues I have on my tray here. And the first thing that you're going to do is you're going to get a piece of tape. You're going to just mark out where the sky meets the water. And this is below the halfway point. And remember, the top of your tape is actually where the bottom of that sky is going to be. Okay, so let's just put it, how about right here? Okay, that's a little off, but that's all right. So right here is the top of that ocean line. Now I'm going to take a big brush, and just like I did before when we were practicing, I'm going to wet the surface first because this is the wet into wet method. I'm using a size 8 round brush, but if my paper were any bigger, I would definitely use a larger brush. Okay, and I'm going to stick with this. I'm going to stick with this brush for now, although a 6 would be just fine. And I'm going to grab the sky color. I'm going to use some ultramarine blue. I think that's going to look really nice. And I'll show you also how to make these clouds in a minute. So you're going to grab a paper towel. Have a paper towel nearby so that we can drop some clouds in. Okay, now if you look at this reference image, the top is much darker than the bottom. So that's how we're going to paint it, just like we practiced. So I'm going to put that stripe right at the top of my super saturated paint. Let's do a little more. I'm going to wash my brush out, dab off the extra, and remember, I'm going to start at the bottom and work my way up, and I'm going to touch that and then drag it down. And you can see it didn't go all the way down. So there's 2 different things that you can do. That means that I can start at the bottom and go back up and grab more and drag it down. Or it means I didn't start out with enough at the very tippy top. Okay, I'm just going to keep doing this. I'm not going to press hard because the harder I press and the more I do this, I'm going to kind of mess with the fibers of the paper. So I'm going to actually just grab more paint because that's just not enough. And if you need to grab more paint, just like I did, start at the very top, slowly drag it out. Okay, there. You can leave it, or if you want to create some of these clouds, you can get a paper towel, crumple it up. I like to kind of crumple it and then re-crumple it. Makes it a little softer. And then while the surface is wet, you can just dab in a few clouds. There you go. That's it. And I'm going to wait for this to dry, and then I'm going to remove the tape. Right, so this is just about dry. I recommend at home waiting till it's totally dry, but I'm impatient, so I'm going to remove mine. So I'm going to remove the tape. I recommend using the same tape. You can tape it once your surface is dry. You can put that tape right on top and you'll have a nice crisp edge. Definitely don't want to add your tape back onto the sky until it is 90% dry. All right, what we're gonna do now is we're creating another gradient for the ocean. So same process, wet into wet, wetting the surface. Ooh, okay, if that happens, that's okay, because it's just gonna get wet again. Grab some water, wet that surface with clean water, ideally. Okay, and I'm gonna grab some of my Prussian blue. Remember, I don't want it to be super drippy. I'm not trying to add lots and lots and lots of water to this surface. I'm going to start with my stripe at the very tippy top. And if it's something like this, if it's very dark, you can actually drag it a little bit more. But do you see how I started at the base of where I had that first bit of paint? So if you're going to do that, you start there, because otherwise it's going to get, you're going to just drag it all out and have to keep adding more. Okay. But I'm going to stop about there so I can really make my gradient gradual. So I'm washing my brush out, cleaned it off with, or dabbed it off. And then I'm going to start at the base. Whoopsies. Let's grab a little more. Go up to that point, go push up, and then pull down. Okay. And if you need more water, you start at the base, go up, grab that paint and drag it down. And this is actually kind of nice. My paper is already a little dry, so it's creating these nice, pretty water lines. If this is not dark enough for you for your painting, then go back while the surface is wet, start with that stripe right at the top, just like you did before, and kind of repeat the process. Now, it only works this way if your paper is wet. There we go, done. Not too bad. And then what you can do once this is dry, then we're going to remove the tape and you'll see this beautiful painting. So I'm going to let that dry and then I'll show you the grand reveal of our beautiful gradient painting. My picture is totally dry, so let's remove the tape. Not too bad. So this only happened because I was impatient. I don't know if you can see this. See those little itty bitty mistakes right there? That happened because I was impatient and didn't let my sky dry completely. So if you see that, that's exactly what's happening. And that is actually not because the paper over here was wet. That's because my tape, I just didn't press it down hard enough. But look at this. So you can make so many different things, whoopsies, just by understanding how to create a gradient. So this was the gradient that was the wet into wet. And now, very quickly, I'm just going to show you one more addition to using that direct outline method gradient for the gradient, and how to kind of, let's take this up one more level and maybe make a little island. What are we going to do here? Let's just use blue. Ooh, pretty. Okay. Not quite blue, a little bit darker than my Prussian blue. And I'm going to paint an outline of maybe an island, or maybe it's like, who knows, the shoreline. It's way off in the distance. So same deal as before when we were practicing our direct outline method. I'm going to paint the darkest area first and then blend it out with a clean, damp brush. And I'm going to add that to my other painting just to show you how you can just only use really just gradients to create a whole picture. So I'm creating this outline. I'm going to wash my brush out, dab off my water, and I'm going to start painting in this middle section that's white. And then I'm going to touch the edge of where I painted that paint, or where I added that paint, and I'm going to let it blend out. There we go. And if it's too light in an area, then just kind of wiggle it around a little bit more. There's my island. And if I wanted to, I could go even further. I could add little trees or things like that. Or if I want to add more shadow, I'm just going to drop it in while it's wet. there you go. So I hope you had a lot of fun today learning about how to use gradients to create realistic images. And just to recap, we covered those two different methods. We covered the direct outline method. We covered the wet into wet method to create different gradients. And I showed you how to create a small painting using both of those methods. I hope you had a ton of fun today. If you have questions or if you want to see these methods used in another object or another picture, just let me know in the comments below, and I hope to see you again next time. Bye-bye, everybody.